right, welcome back to another episode of Redeemer Unfiltered, where this summer we are journeying through the whole book of Genesis, chapter by chapter, and doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what's happening on the podcast than we are on Sunday mornings. So Sunday mornings, we're surveying stuff, we're hitting the high points, but then throughout the week, during the podcast, we're going to make sure that every chapter is unpacked. So today, we're going to look at chapters 21 through 27. All right, so in chapter 21, there is relief to a lot of tension that as we've been wondering, like, will God fulfill his promise? And now we can finally breathe because Abraham and Sarah have had their first son. They've given birth to Isaac. And so we're like, okay, like God is true to his promise. I mean, it's been a long time, like 25 years, but he finally came through. And I think it's just important to know, like, God always keeps his promises, but he does so in his timing and in his way. Well, in chapter 21, after Isaac is born, and I think it's interesting. This is probably one of the most anticipated events in all of Scripture, next to Jesus. I would say the birth of Isaac, most anticipated event. And it's pretty quickly hit on, and then we move on. And so the joy that's experienced from the tension being released is pretty quickly taken away as we're brought back to the reality that because of compromises that have been made, there's now going to be conflict, all right? And so we're going to see that conflict starting in verse 8 of chapter 21. In chapter 21, Isaac is 2 or 3 years old. Ishmael is 15 or 16. And Ishmael is laughing at Isaac. And the word for laughing here basically means mocking, picking on. And so you could make a case that most likely this is a 16-year-old being a bully to a 3-year-old, right? So for a lot of people, the birth of Isaac brought joy. It was a reason for joy. For Ishmael, it was a reason for scorn, right? Well, Sarah sees this. She sees her little boy getting picked on. She gets mad, and she basically says, like, I want to kick you out of the family, right? And so she kicks him out. She's like, Abraham, I don't care who he is to you. I know he's your son, and whatever, I want them gone. So she kicks him out, leaves them with nothing other than what Abraham gives them to go away with, and they're as good as dead. So they're out in the desert. They've ran out of resources. They know that they're about to die. She basically separates herself from Ishmael, Hagar does, and goes like, I can't look at my son while he dies in front of me. And so she's trying to get away. She cries out to God. God hears her cry. Then God shows up and is like, hey, I'm going to take care of you guys, right? He's like, I promise you that you're going to be a great nation one day, and things are going to be fine. So God comes through and promises to take care of Hagar and Ishmael. What's interesting is one of the ways that God provides for them when he sees her is he's like, here's a well. Like, you're dying of thirst. Here's a well. Here's some water. Kind of a cool story. We actually know where this well is. This is currently known as Zamzam Well, and it is in Saudi Arabia, specifically in Mecca. And so the way the Muslims tell the story of Hagar and Ishmael is a little different than the Bible, but we both record a similar event and record this well. Just the Muslims have claim to it. It's in Mecca. They're not going to let you see it unless you are a Muslim, right? But that well still exists today, right? And so that brings us to chapter 22. In chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, we read this. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. I love this, not because it's an easy story, but because it just shows how masterful Scripture is written. I mean, as Moses is writing this, it's just incredible. So the boy is born. We think there's relief to the tension of the story, like, okay, like things are gonna be okay. But then that relief is just a quick breather before we're thrown back into the ring. First with a conflict between the baby mama drama between Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac. And now we see it with God once again, kind of throwing another wrench in the gears by saying like, okay, now go kill your son. It's like, what? Like, if he dies, the promise ends. Like, this is a pretty big test. So God commands Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. This is the greatest test yet, right? So here's a question you might have, which is why why would God command this? And this seems pretty jacked up. What's interesting is during this time, child sacrifice was actually pretty standard practice. So it seems weird to us to be told that by our God, but for Abraham's probably. It's like, yeah, that's kind of what other gods say to do. Maybe this God's no different. So it's not out of the ordinary for Abraham to hear this. But what's important to know is that it was never God's intention to sacrifice Isaac. So at the front end, this is God saying, do you think I'm like other gods? All right, go sacrifice your son. But what we see here is that God's nature is to provide what's required. I love this because what's going to happen is there's going to be a substitute provided so that Isaac doesn't have to die, that something dies in his place, which is pointing us towards the cross, right? And so with that, we realize like God is in the habit of providing what's required. So if the gospel requires perfection, or salvation requires perfection, what we know is that what God requires, he provides in Jesus, right? And so once again, back to the question, like why would God command this? Here's something that's interesting. In a culture where child sacrifice was normal, we see God stopping the hand of Abraham, which is a way of showing how God actually does not approve of this type of worship. He's like, I'm not like those other gods. I don't approve of this. I have a better way, right? But ultimately, this event is going to serve to foreshadow a greater event, a greater sacrifice, another one and only son who is loved by his father. I love the way Tim Keller puts it. He says, Jesus is the true and better Isaac, who is not just offered up by his father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us all. While God said to Abraham, now I know you love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you love from me. Now we can say at the foot of the cross, now we know you, God, love me because you did not withhold your son, your only son whom you loved for me. So this is all pointing us to Jesus. All right. Well, that gets us to chapter 23. Sarah dies. Abraham secures a cave from the locals so he can bury her there. And this cave, once again, we know where this cave is. It's about 19 miles southeast of Jerusalem. If you Google Cave of the Patriarchs, you can find it today. But in verse 19 of chapter 23, we read, after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre. This is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And so he has purchased this property. And this is significant because it shows us how Abraham now has claim to the land of Canaan, the land that will be the promised land, the land that God is giving to him. Like all of a sudden, he's got kind of a monument here with the burial site of his wife. He's got land that he owns. And so all of a sudden, he's got legal rights to the land. So that's a significant event that we see in chapter 23. Well, chapter 24, we're told Abraham was old, well advanced in years. At this point, I feel like that's kind of redundant. It's like, we get it. The dude's really old, right? But he's old, he's good as dead, and somehow he's still kicking. But Abraham has one last thing to do before he breathes his last. He needs to get his son a wife, but he doesn't want Isaac to marry a local. Right. So he's like, I need my son, if we're going to keep this promise going, like he needs to have a wife so he can have some kids, and he's still batching it up. So he's like, I want you to go wife, but you can't just marry any wife. He has a very specific idea of the type of woman, the type of background he wants Isaac's wife to come from. I think about it, this is probably not the best illustration, but think about the movie Aladdin, right? You have Aladdin, who's kind of like a street rat guy living off the streets, poor, beggar, stealer. Then you have Princess Jasmine. What type of guy do you think Princess Jasmine's dad wanted her to marry? Like, he had in mind, not that she would marry someone from the streets, but that she would marry probably someone else who is also royalty. Okay, and so like in the same way that a king would want his princess to marry another king or another prince, we see Abraham's like, I don't want her to marry someone with a background that's pagan, a background that's idolatrous. I want her to marry someone from my background, from my kindred. And so he wants her to marry someone of a certain cultural makeup. All right. All that to say, Abraham wants Isaac to marry someone he approves of, and he has in mind what he does and does not want. Right. So he sends a servant all the way back So that's a 21-day journey, all the way back to where they began, so he can find Isaac a wife from the same background as Abraham's family. He goes to the local watering hole where women go to get water, and he throws up a prayer. Like, God, help me find the right one. This reminds me of someone on a boat fishing. Like, God, it'd be really great if I caught a fish on this cast. He's basically saying, like, God, if you could help me catch the right wife, that would be amazing. Maybe catch isn't the right word. Find. And then out comes Rebecca, and we're told she's very attractive in appearance. And it turns out that God is working this whole thing out, and she's the one. And by the end of the chapter, we see her following in the footsteps of Abraham as the servant's like, hey, would you come with me to marry my master's son? So we see Rebecca at this point leaving all she has ever known to journey into the unknown. She's actually kind of following in the same footsteps as Abraham, doing the exact same thing that Abraham did as he left all that he had ever known to journey into the unknown. That brings us to chapter 25. And so at the end of chapter 11, a new section of Genesis began with the life of Abraham. So chapter 11, towards the end, it's like, and these are the generations of Abraham. Now in chapter 25, this section comes to a close. So we've kind of seen another chapter of Genesis, so to speak, closed. We're going to enter a new section. Well, we find out in chapter 25 that after Sarah passed away, Abraham took another wife. And he had quite a few other kids with her, but ultimately he gives all he has to Isaac. And at 175 years of age, he breathes his last breath. All right. We see a brief reuniting of Isaac and Ishmael as they both represent, or as they are both present for the funeral where Abraham is buried in the same tomb as his first wife, Sarah. And from here, we get a brief rundown of Ishmael's 12 sons who become 12 tribes in Arabia. And this shows us that God has kept the promise he made back in chapter 17 and back in chapter 21 regarding Ishmael, that Ishmael too would be a great nation. And so that's what rises up from these 12 sons is Ishmael now has a legacy of being a great nation as well. Following that, we get the generations of Isaac. It turns out Rebecca, like Sarah, was also barren. And it's not a short barrenness. I mean, Sarah was barren for 25 years after she was promised a kid. Rebecca's barren for 19 years, right? It's not as bad as Sarah, but still a long time. Well, in God's timing, he opens her womb and she gets pregnant with twins, and they start fighting with each other before they're even born. Definitely some foreshadowing going on here. Esau is born first. He comes out covered in hair, kind of like a little Ewok from Star Wars. Then Jacob comes second, and he's basically the complete opposite of his brother. Esau grows up to be an outdoorsy hunter type guy, while Jacob preferred to stay indoors. Esau wanted to hang with his dad. Jacob liked to hang with his mom. So Isaac finds himself favoring Esau. He's like, that's my boy. Rebecca finds herself favoring Jacob. That's my boy. And just a life lesson here. When parents play favorites, never ends well, right? So dad likes him, mom likes him, and it's just not good. Right? Then at the end of the chapter, both boys are grown up. We kind of flew through their childhood really quick. Esau comes in off the field. He's exhausted. I mean, he's tired. Meanwhile, Jacob's been playing Betty Homemaker, and he's got some stew cooking up on the stove. And so Esau's like, hey, I'm about to starve to death. Like, I literally, if I don't eat, I'm going to die. Could you give me some food? And Jacob sees the desperation and thinks, like, I can take advantage of this. So he goes, I will give you some soup if you sell me your birthright. And Esau's like, what good's a birthright if I'm dead, which I'm literally about to die? So yes, like, you can have my birthright. I'll sell it to you. Like, give me the food. He gives him the food. And after he eats, he's just like, what a punk. like Esau, like, finally he's got some nutrients in him. And he's like, that guy would have rather watched me die than, So either way, like, we see that Esau is not going to be a big fan of his brother Jacob. He sees his brother Jacob as kind of, shady, I guess you could say. Right. Well, that gets us to chapter 26. God affirms the same promise he made to Abraham to Isaac. He's like, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Your offspring are going to be more than the stars in the sky. But there's some adversity to the promise. Like as you read chapter 26, there's things that seem like they could stop the promise from being fulfilled. There's famine in the land. It's like, what if everybody dies? Just like Abraham and Abimelech, where Abraham feared for his life, we see Isaac, like, if Abimelech thinks that like Rebecca is my wife, he'll kill me. So I'm just going to say she's my sister. I feel like we've read this before. Maybe like the sins of his father are now being repeated. But, all right, and so we see that he fears losing his life by Abimelech. Then a little bit later, there's all this controversy over wells and whose water is it? Is it my water? Is it your water? And so all this stuff is happening, all right? And so as we see this, all right, in the midst of the adversity, Isaac somehow is becoming very, very wealthy. So much so that Abimelech kicks him out of the land. So after Abimelech's like, why'd you say she was your sister if she was your wife? Like, you just like your dad, get out of here. So, I mean, he's been kicked out, right? So Abimelech kicks him out and says, like, I want nothing to do with you because, like, so he's kicked out by Abimelech. And then what we see is Abimelech comes back to Isaac and he's like, hey, so like, I know I kicked you out. You think we hate you, which we kind of do, but we can see that God's with you. So we'd like to make peace. Like, are you in? To which Isaac says, yeah, like, let's make a covenant. Let's make peace. Let's coexist. Then at the very end of the chapter, we get this little detail that Esau had married foreign women, and this makes life bitter for his mom and dad. That brings us to chapter 27. Isaac is old. So when we started this, like, Abraham was old. Now Isaac's in the same boat. He's nearly blind. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to live. So he calls Esau in. So Esau, the hairy Ewok boy, walks in and he's like, hey, like, I know you've made my life bitter with the whole marrying Hittite women, but like, you're still my firstborn. And so he says, go out into the fields, kill me something, go hunting, come back in and fix it up, grill it up for me, fix a delicious dinner, and then I'm going to bless you, right? And so a blessing is different than an inheritance, right? So the birthright is the inheritance, that's physical possessions. The birthright's more of like a spiritual favor, right? Like showing spiritual favor over someone's life. And so the blessing's different, and a blessing is irrevocable. Once you give it, you can't take it back, right? And so he's like, go do this, and then I will bless you. I will ask God to show you spiritual favor for the rest of your days. Something that's interesting with that, though, is in chapter 25, we learn that God actually wants to work through Jacob to continue the line of blessing, not Esau. He wants to work through the younger, not the older. So the fact that Isaac at this point is trying to bless Esau shows that Isaac is actually trying to get around God's plan. So he's not in a good place with God right here with the way that he's acting. So anyways, Esau heads out. Meanwhile, Rebecca is listening in, and she doesn't want Esau to get the blessing. She's like, that's not how that's not how the plan's supposed to go. Like, Jacob's supposed to get blessing, so I got to do something. And so she decides to take matters into her own hands, right? She's like, I don't know what God's going to do, so I better do something. And so she starts trying to fix things. And so she goes, all right, Jacob, come here. And she pulls in Jacob. She goes, hey, this is what your dad just asked Esau to do, and so we're gonna undercut him. Go get me a goat. I'll fix it up and it'll be awesome. I'll make a great meal. And then I'm going to put you in your brother's clothes, those stinky outdoor clothes that he wears. And then we're going to put some animal skin on your hands. So that way, if he touches you, he feels that hairiness. And he's like, this must be my son, which leads to the question, like, how hairy was Esau that they put animal skin on Jacob's hands to like try to fool his dad. Right. And so either way, Jacob goes in, gives his dad the dinner, deceives, straight up lies. He even brings God into the picture and makes God part of his sin. Not that God did not sin, but he starts leveraging God in a sinful way. And so he deceives his dad. His dad thinks that he's blessing Esau, but his dad speaks a spiritual blessing over Jacob instead. Meanwhile, like, Jacob leaves, and shortly after, Esau walks in. And he's like, got you an animal. I'm going to go grill it up. And his dad's like, wait, what? Who is this? And then it clicks, right? It clicks. He's like, I was tricked. Like, this is the real Esau. Who in the world was that? And he starts to violently shake in anger. He's like, he was so mad that his wife and his son would do something so deceptive, right? And so he's mad. Then Esau's like, but you can still give me a blessing, right? And he's like, no, I gave it all away. And so then Esau gets bitter and he's mad. And it literally says that he basically falls asleep at night by sharpening a knife blade and dreaming of the day that he will kill his brother. He's like, it's just really soothing as I think about stabbing him in the neck, right? And so he's dreaming about killing his brother. Rebecca knows this isn't going to end well, so she goes, hey, Jacob, I love you, but you've got to flee. You've got to get out. Go back to my homeland. My brother's there. Just live there until either Esau's anger goes away or till at least it settles down to where he just hates you and doesn't want to kill you. So you need to get out of here, right? And so by the end of chapter 25, we see just how the end of chapter 27, we see just how dysfunctional this family is. I mean, Esau is married to two Hittite women. He has little to no regard for the God of his father, Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah are playing favorites with their two sons. Isaac tries to get around God's plan by blessing Esau instead of Jacob. Jacob leads her son into some scandalous deception. And now we're almost full circle back to the sins of Cain and Abel, or Cain, where Jacob is about to get murdered by his brother. Thankfully, though, he escapes. But in all this, here's what we see. We see how God works through just human activity, the good, the bad, the ugly. He works through human activity to accomplish his purposes. So whether we do things good, bad, whether we're doing what's right or not, God's able to work it out, and make it to be exactly what he needs it to be to fulfill his greater purposes. Right, so that concludes chapter 27. We're going to take next week off. So if you're following along in the reading plan, this is a chance to either get caught up if you're behind, or to go back and reread something or read something else this week. Maybe hang out in the Psalms. I'll be hanging out in the Psalms next week personally, so if you want to just hang out with me in the Psalms, not that we're going to talk about it, but you could just in spirit be with me. But then we're going to come back the next week. So we're taking next week off for the podcast. And then next week, we're going to hit a couple of more chapters. We're going to do chapters 28 through 31. So that'll be in 2 weeks. So hang tight. But hopefully this podcast is helpful in your personal journey as you're doing deeper dives into the book of Genesis on your own.